And those women are seen to have nothing to lose. And some men believe that with such women, it is all right to force them into sex because of their low status. In some cultures, ideas about male honour and female purity and female modesty are used to justify and excuse violence against women. In some honour cultures, male honour is seen in terms of status and dominance and reputation, and honour is based on men's ability to enforce their will on others, to command deferential treatment, and to protect their family and their possessions. Honour cultures involve traditional gender ideologies and strong family norms, and often norms of male virility, male sexual freedom, and female chastity. So, for example, one study compared Brazilian and US university students. It found that Brazilian students were more likely than US students to think that when a woman is unfaithful, this makes her male partner less manly. And if the male partner uses violence, if he responds to her unfaithfulness with violence, this is more acceptable, more excusable. And in another study in Latin America and the southern United States, the researchers found that women and men from honour cultures were more tolerant of men's violence towards female partners and more blaming of victims. Now, differences in attitudes towards violence against women in different countries, in different cultures, reflect different beliefs about gender roles. Societies with lower rates of violence against women have more gender egalitarian attitudes and a greater intolerance of violence. But I should say the cultural differences I've described are not reducible only to gender. They're also shaped by other factors, of course. Next slide, please. I've talked about attitudes so far, but violence against women is shaped also by the social, economic, political, and cultural relations of particular communities. Violence against women is shaped above all by gender inequalities. We know that in families and intimate relationships, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, and so on, male dominance is associated with higher rates of violence. Where you have families where men are economically dominant and politically dominant in the family, you have higher rates of abuse of the wife. Wife abuse is more likely in couples with a dominant husband and an economically dependent wife. And where you have a family with an uneven power structure and there's conflict and there's marital conflict, then you get a much higher risk of domestic violence. There are other factors shape violence against women as well. Violence against women occurs in all classes, among rich people, poor people, and so on. But it is more common, at least in my country, it is more common in families and communities that are poor, that have low socioeconomic status and unemployment. And that's because low socioeconomic status increases the risk of abuse because of the other things that go along with that, such as crowding, living very close together, hopelessness, stress, some men's sense of feeling inadequate. Social isolation is another factor. It's a cause of violence against women, and it's the result of violence against women. Women who have strong family networks and strong friendship networks have lower rates of violence. Now, violence against women also is shaped by wider historical and political forces. In my country, among Indigenous people, among Aboriginal people, there are very high rates of violence, very high rates of murder, of rape, and so on. And that violence is shaped by colonisation, by histories of colonisation in Australia, and the ways in which family and community have broken down because of colonisation. And internationally, around the globe, we know that violence against women is shaped by wars, by political conflicts, by militarism and imperialism, and so on. So I've said so far that to explain violence against women, we must look at social norms and social beliefs. We must also look at social relations and social structures. To stop violence against women, we must change community attitudes, but we must also address structural conditions, power relations, structural inequalities that feed violence against women. Next slide, please. There are also some local contexts, some local spaces or contexts that are particularly dangerous for women, and that show high rates of tolerance for violence against women. So, for example, studies in Australia, in America, and I think in some Scandinavian countries, find that younger men in their 20s and 30s, have better attitudes towards violence against women than older men. They're less tolerant of that violence. But among the youngest age groups, young boys 12, 13, 14, have the worse attitudes than 20-year-old males. And there may be three reasons why. First, it may be educational differences, that younger boys haven't gone through school and university and been exposed to the sort of liberalising effect of school and university education. Second, it may be that younger boys haven't developed the empathy, the moral empathy, sensitivity, moral awareness that older boys and girls develop. This pattern of younger males being especially tolerant of violence, it may also reflect boys' peer cultures. Among boys, gender segregation, sort of keeping the sexes apart, and homophobia peak in early adolescence. In boys' early teens, 13, 14, 15, there's a very strong gender policing of boys' lives and strong homophobia. And in this context, boys may be especially tolerant of violence against girls and women. Gender segregation and homophobia decline as boys reach late secondary school and university, if they go to university, and the gender gap between boys and girls gets smaller, although it's still large. There's also evidence of other contexts in which violence supportive norms and violence is particularly strong. So we know that in the United States, there are some university campuses with high rates of sexual violence. And those campuses, especially male college fraternities, have gender segregation, a belief in male sexual conquest, high consumption of alcohol, the use of pornography, and a general belief in gender inequality. Another context that is similar in some ways is the military. And for example, there was a study in Alaska among soldiers, and it found that among military groups where domestic violence and sexual assault are particularly common, the male soldiers use pornography very often, they drink together very often, they have a disrespect for women, they talk in ways that are disrespectful for women, and that increases their perpetration of violence against women. There are also some male peer groups, what I've called homosocial, male-male peer groups, where violence against women can be encouraged. When young men have strong friendships with other men who are abusive or who are tolerant of violence, they're more likely to commit sexual assault themselves. And so, for example, in young male gangs, bonding among boys and young men in gangs can contribute to gang rape, to group or gang rape of women. Now, I've written elsewhere in another report of some other factors that are important. Some other factors that we know shape men's tolerance for violence include their own exposure to violence as children, living with violence themselves as children, using pornography, especially violent pornography, and other factors, but I won't talk about those here. Can I get the next slide, please? I want to now move to more practical questions. The more practical question of how we can involve men in violence prevention.